Hey everybody, welcome back. My name's Kurt, my shop. This video is going to be the teardown of the LS1 out of the 99 Camaro. And I just want to give you guys, I'm just going to dive right in here and give you guys a close-up of this motor and see absolutely how disgusting this thing is. This is why it had to come out. And I noticed some stuff that's leaking that I didn't even think was leaking. You have a PCV hose right here. It is just broken right in two, so it's puking oil on the back of the motor, along with the valve covers. That valve cover just dripping right there. I showed you guys the oil pan. The oil pan is just completely nasty. Dripping oil everywhere. The front cover, just completely covered in grime. Right side of the motor, valve cover yet again, leaking on this side. So as you can see, this thing is just disgusting. And if you're like me and hate oil leaks, this is kind of a worst case scenario. It's leaking out of everywhere. And it's got 200,000 miles, 205,000, so I'm sure no maintenance has ever been done as far as this type of maintenance to this vehicle and motor. So here we go. It is, it's bad. As far as I'm concerned, it's bad. So I'm gonna go start the disassembly of this thing and get this motor apart. First things first, we need to get the motor off the cradle. And so for that, I'll get my engine hoist out. Undo the motor, lift the motor up with the transmission off the cradle, get the transmission unbolted, get the torque converter unbolted first, transmission unbolted, pull the transmission off. That way we got access to the rear of the motor, and as far as the front goes, I'm gonna have to pull all the accessory drive off this thing, and that'll get us down to the timing cover. As far as the top goes, I've got to pull the intake manifold off the whole thing because underneath here, the valley cover, there's no sense doing all this if I don't replace the valley cover seal on there. So that's got to come off. Valve covers have to come off on both sides. So basically a bunch of this stuff's got to come off the motor, if not almost all of it to get to it. And then as far as the oil pan goes, so as far as the oil pan, I've got kind of a standard LS engine stand for wheeling an engine around the shop. I'm actually going to take this motor off the cradle and I'm going to put it on that stand. On that stand, it allows me to wheel the motor around the shop, move it where I want to, plus it allows access to everything on that stand. Oil pan, rear main, front main, top of the motor. So it's going to be what I'm going to use to do this, and I'll show you guys that once I get this apart. So disassembly off the cradle is fairly basic. You just have to undo the motor mounts and pull it off. There's going to be a few lines to undo. Obviously the rack and pinion has got to be separated from the power steering pump. Those lines have to come off, and a few others, but I'm not going to get into that. It's kind of self-explanatory when you get it this far. It's kind of stuff that you could see. So I'm going to come back when I get this motor on the other stand. Okay, so got the engine off the cradle, and here it is behind me, and I'll go over the stands with you. So this stand is what I like to use for all my LS motors and small block and big block Chevys. Basically, it attaches to the motor mounts where the motor mount position is on the block of all the motors, and has wheels so you can pretty much move around the shop with ease. Plus it has the ability to leave the transmission attached and still balances on the stand. They're really not expensive. I can't remember the place I found it, but you can do an online search and find it. It's about $100 for the stand. The nice thing about it, as you can see, is that also the back of the motor is completely accessible, the front of the motor, the sides, top, bottom. The only reason why I pulled the accessories off the front of this motor is just because I wanted access to the motor mount bolts. No, excuse me. Why I pulled the accessories off is when it was still in the car, I wanted easier access to the engine mount bolts in the car, so I just pulled the accessories off. They had to come off anyway, so I removed them earlier before I even dropped the motor out. So here's how it sits, and now pull the transmission off and get a bunch of this other stuff off and start replacing some seals. Okay, the motor's partially torn down now. Most of the covers are off, the oil pan's off, front and rear covers are off, valve covers are off. I still have not pulled the intake off to do the valley cover. I'm going to do that soon. I just wanted to go over a couple things with you on these motors if you're already not aware of it. The main thing is when you're doing the back cover here, there is this little thing they call the barbell. You really probably should replace this. It's a cheap part, good idea. That directs oil flow. If you don't have it, it's critical. If you do not have that in the motor, you're not going to have oil pressure. So not a critical thing to replace while you're there, but I would highly suggest it. The other thing that people don't realize when they're doing these motors is when they're doing the front and rear cover, the cover actually moves around on the block. It doesn't just bolt up in one spot. And so if you just bolt up the cover, there's a chance that either the front or rear seal will leak, or also the oil pan will leak, because what happens is the cover can move left and right and also up and down. And you want to bolt the cover up so it is centered on the crankshaft. And also, I like to use a level, and you can do the oil pan first, but if you're doing something like this, it's easier to do the front and rear cover first and then put the oil pan on. But what I like to do is put a level on the bottom of the block and make sure that the cover is directly level with that. If you do that, make sure the covers are level. It helps a lot of problems, specifically with the oil pan. If the covers aren't level and you bolt the oil pan up, if the covers are too high, you're going to have a gap and it's going to leak. If the covers are too low, then it's going to make the oil pan not sit flat, and you're going to have a leak more on the side down here. So make sure that you have those covers level with the block before you tighten them down. Also, on the four corners where the cover meets the bottom of the block, a little bit of a couple drops of silicone adhesive where the oil pan bolts up to that is also recommended. So other than that, on this one too, I'm going to order a timing chain. This one has a little bit too much play. I've seen a lot worse on these motors when I have them apart, but I figure it's cheap insurance. The motor has about 200,000 on it. So for 50, 60 bucks, I'm gonna put a new chain and the gears on there as well. So those are ordered. Take another day to get those, but I'd say it's a good idea to do that while you're there. Honestly, I have not seen a broken timing chain on an LS motor in the shop I work at. I know it's definitely possible. I know guys have broken them all the time. So it's kind of up to you. If you're in there, it's a budget build, your decision. For $50, like I said, cheap insurance, I would recommend doing the timing chain while you've got it apart. Another thing you want to look at is on the rockers here. They have little needle bearings in here, and you just kind of want to make sure you don't see anything laying in the bottom there. Specifically, make sure you check the bottom of the pan. Usually what happens if the needle bearings come apart, they go right to the pan and they'll sit in the bottom there. If you see any needle bearings in the bottom of the pan, make sure you check your rockers, because that's where they came from, and it's something you definitely want to address if you have it apart this far. Rockers are pretty easy to replace, and if you use OEM rockers, they're fairly inexpensive. I usually recommend upgrades, just because why not, right? Upgrades are great. So that's where we've got the motor right now. This side, for some reason, actually looks a lot better. I don't know why this side looks a lot cleaner with less baked on oil buildup, but you can kind of tell by the look at this motor that it's pretty nasty. This is, I don't want to point fingers here, but usually this is the type of thing that happens when you don't change your oil. I know it sucks to do your maintenance, but change your oil, people. I mean, it's cheap insurance. What you'd rather do? Change your oil every 3,000 to 5,000 miles or buy a motor. So please, I need to make a point on this while I'm here. You need to change your oil religiously. Newer motors have so many things. I mean, variable valve timing, variable cam timing, displacement on demand. It's a plethora of things, and I'm not going to get into all of them here, but motors are a lot more complicated than they were even 20 years ago. Even GM motors, between the LT1 motors versus the LS1 motors. I'm talking about the new LT1, not the old LT1. It's just vitally important to change your oil. It's cheap insurance. I have pulled apart motors that look brand new still on the inside when people religiously change the oil, and it makes a difference. I mean, I personally recommend changing the oil every 3,000 and everything, and I use synthetic in everything I own, and I've been using synthetic for the past 20 years. If you change your oil religiously, there's really nothing wrong with conventional oil still. I prefer synthetic if you get down to it, and I'm not going to get into in the video right now with that as well, but synthetic really is a lot better oil. It resists thermal breakdown a lot better. It flows better. It's just a lot better oil, and it's not priced that much more. So if you don't want your motor to look like this, please change your oil. Anyway, now that I've ranted on about that, I'm gonna say this thing is pretty much ready to go back together. I'm still waiting on some parts. Like I said, I ordered a timing chain. I did not have a spare barbell for the back of the motor. I'm gonna order one of those as well, just to throw in there. And I forgot to order my valley cover gasket, so I'm gonna pull that off when I get those. So I'm gonna get that stuff and clean the rest of the stuff up and throw it all back together. And then when I come back, this thing will be reassembled. I also will probably take that transmission and replace the front and rear seal while I'm there as well. The torque converter seal and just the rear output seal. I mean, again, cheap insurance. While the transmission's out, it's a lot easier to do it now than have to take the transmission back out and replace that torque converter seal. So I'll throw those in there as well. So I'm gonna put this thing back together, clean it up a little bit because it's just filthy disgusting, and I will come back and show you guys the motor when it's put back together. And then after that, it's gonna go back there in its home. So some of you are probably like, well, why don't you just turn the motor down? Why don't you do some upgrades? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Well, I've thought about it, and I really wanted to at least do long tube headers because I do long tube headers on everything. And I also was going to do off-road Y pipe, a few other things on the motor, and I was thinking about doing a cam upgrade as well. Where I'm at on this is I was trying to keep it as absolute cheap as possible. I really only did this to pull the motor to replace all the seals and stop my oil leak. And the fact that it is a 200,000 mile motor, I just figure I'm just gonna put it back together, fix the oil leaks, get it done as cheap as possible, and run it. If it holds together much longer, you never know, maybe I'll change my mind and do a cam upgrade. But for now, not knowing, you know, longevity of the motor, I might as well just do it the way I was thinking versus put a bunch of parts in it and maybe have something happen. Because with this many miles on a motor, I would prefer just do a complete disassembly and a full rebuild if I'm gonna do many upgrades on it. So for now, just reseal it, put it back in the car. So here we go. And one last shot of it. I wouldn't want anyone thinking I skipped a step. So before I put it back together, one last little quick video showing the engine that's basically as far disassembled that I'm gonna go with it. And the intake is off, valley cover's off, and that's it. It took a lot to clean it up. There was a bunch of oil and crap everywhere. As you can see, I took great care to try and keep any debris out of the intake ports, but that is it till we get it back together. So there it is. Every single seal that I can think of has been replaced, or will be replaced, excuse me. I will also be putting a new oil pressure sending unit on this, and I will probably throw a new cam sensor while I'm there too. So other than that, that's it. I'll be right back with it assembled. Fast forward a couple nights and it's all back together. All new seals, gaskets, and everything external on this motor that can possibly leak has been replaced. So I guess let's start at the back of the motor and work forward. I replaced also the camshaft position sensor and the oil sending unit just because we're on the back of the motor, and when this motor's in the car, they're not that easy to get to. So cheap insurance, so I have to worry about those later. Replace those while I was doing all the gaskets and seals. Also did new spark plugs and wires. The wires are Chevy Performance wires, and the plugs are NGK single platinum plugs. I like to use those a lot. The double platinums and iridiums are great as well. I've also used those a lot as well. And for those that want to use the AC Delco original iridium plugs, those are great too. I would recommend any of them. Any of them are good plugs. So also on the front of the motor here, behind the timing cover, I did do a new GM oil pump, and I also did a new timing chain set and gears. Just because with mileage on this motor and the problems with the oil pumps, I didn't want to have to tear this all back apart if, say, in 5,000 miles, my oil pressure started dropping like they usually do when they get about this kind of mileage on them. So new GM oil pump, and then the timing set. So that should eliminate any problems that I can think of that might arise. Other than that, basically, as I said, went through and replaced all the seals and gaskets. So from the top to bottom, we have the Plenum Seals, have the valley cover seals, did a new knock sensor harness while I was there, just to help seal those up a little better where they sit down in the valley. It helps seal them up from water intrusion a little bit. New valve cover gaskets, front and rear timing cover gaskets. Actually, they're complete new covers. It's almost cheaper to buy the whole cover set with all the gaskets and bolts for the front and rear timing cover. That's comes with the cover, the bolts, the cover gasket, and the main seal gasket as one unit. They're like 60 bucks. Replaced front and rear as that as well. The oil pan gasket, and as well as this little bypass plug. I replaced that gasket as well. Gonna change the oil up in it as well, put a new filter on it. I'm trying to think, I believe that was it on the motor. And also with the transmission while I was there, did the torque converter input seal and the output seal as well. Just because I was there, a lot easier to just replace those. So anyway, all been replaced, a few new parts in it, and now time to get it back on the cradle and back in the car. One last thing I do have to do before I put this on the cradle is I am upgrading the motor mounts, trans mount, and torque arm mount. So I've got a set of polyurethane mounts. I've got to put in the old GM mounts. They kind of have a clamshell type mount where you have to drill and separate the clamshell and put the polyurethane mount inside the steel clamshell and put it back together. So go ahead and do that and get this back on the cradle. So here we are, we have the engine and the transmission back on the cradle. I wanted to point out one thing though that's makes your life easier if you ever have to do some maintenance in the future with the steering rack, and that's with the driver's side steering bolt, where the bolt goes through the K-member that holds the rack in place. You got the one here and the one over here. Close up right here. Here's the passenger side. Notice how there is a lot of room for the bolt to come up and out. On this side, if you notice where the bolt is, I've got it removed right there, but otherwise there's not enough room for that bolt to come up without hitting the alternator and especially the oil pan and engine block. So normally what you have to do on these, if you're doing the steering rack in the vehicle, is you have to actually undo the motor mount, take the alternator off, jack the motor up just to get that one bolt out. So it's a lot easier if you have the motor out or somewhere in this situation, just to reverse that bolt and have it go through the bottom instead of the top, and make your life a lot easier if you ever have to pull the steering rack in the future. So that's what I'm gonna do on mine. Also on here, we have the new poly engine mounts on the left and right side. And also back there, we've got it ready for the torque arm mount as well. Haven't got that in. I'll throw that in when the motor's up in the air going back in the vehicle. But back on the Cradle, just have to put the exhaust back on. The only thing I have to fix on this is I did break a head pipe stud right here. I've actually already got it center drilled out, and I just got to rethread it and put a stud back in there. So that's about one of the last things I have to do to get the exhaust back on here, and then start throwing this back into the car. I think that's about it. I can't think of anything else that comes to mind before this goes back up in the car, but I just did want to point out the steering rack bolt. So that saves you a lot of trouble in the future if you ever have to pull the steering rack out, because otherwise it's kind of a pain. If you flip the bolt before, if you have to pull the rack out, it makes it super easy. Just pop 2 bolts out, undo the tie rod ends, and the rack comes out. So. All right, and that concludes the second video in the series of 3 of getting this motor and trans out of the car, getting it all sealed up. The oil leaks hopefully will have disappeared. And the next video in the series will be putting the motor back in the Camaro. I'll try and keep it shorter for you guys. Most of all the how-tos were kind of explained in the first video. So the second video, try and keep it shorter, and we'll get the motor and transmission back in the car and get it back up and running. So hope you guys liked what you watched. Thanks again for watching, and till next time, we'll see you later.